It is November 19th, 1966. Paul McCartney and his girlfriend, Jane Asher, fly out of Nairobi, Kenya, on their way back to London. For nearly 2 weeks, Paul has jetted and driven all throughout Europe and then into Africa, much of it while in disguise, an experience that Paul, who for years now could not take one step outside without hordes of fans and press converging upon him, found incredibly liberating. For just a moment there, he was able to step back inside of himself, inside of the Paul that he knew, rather than Paul, the world-famous Beatle. So as the plane soars back to London, back to the heart of Beatlemania, back to the crushing demands of his everyday life, Paul begins to think of a different reality. A reality where he and the Beatles are not the mop-top sensations, the boys whose duty it is to be wheeled out before thousands and thousands of screaming fans over and over, day after day, a product to be packaged, sold, and consumed. He imagined that they were something else entirely, that they themselves could don a disguise, just as he had done on his vacation. Paul had an idea. Welcome to the making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Time to rewind. On August 29th, the Beatles played at Candlestick Park, San Francisco, a performance that would mark the end of the most nightmarish year of touring that they had endured yet, and the show that would turn out to be their very last as a touring group. It had all been far too much, and for the first time in their history, it was time not to speed up, but finally to slow down. John jets off to Spain, where he is to star as Private Gripweed in Richard Lester's How I Won the War.
Well, our officer calls me up and he says to me, Musketeer Gripweed. He was a tall chap. Some would call him Weedy. I did.
George and Patty head down to Bombay, India, where George is to take sitar lessons from his mentor, Ravi Shankar. Paul and Ringo simply take a breather. The Beatles, as the world and their adoring fans know them, have vanished. But one evening, at the Santa Isabel villa where he is staying, John sits down and records a demo of a song he has been writing during his time in Spain. It is named Strawberry Fields Forever. On Monday, September 26th, Brian Epstein was hospitalized. It will later be revealed that this was due to a drug overdose. But he's right back to action on the 3rd of October, where he insists, despite the lack of news from them, that the Beatles are still very much together, with no intention of splitting. He does confirm, however, for the moment at least, that there are no plans for any upcoming Beatles concerts. This does little to quell the rumors. On October 9th, John celebrates his 26th birthday, still in Spain for How I Won the War. He is joined by Ringo and his wife Maureen.
Yeah, I went and hung out because he was lonely. And, we really supported each other a lot. And so, he was out there being this actor.
The month goes on. As far as Beatles news is concerned, still nothing. But the world keeps spinning, for better, and as it often is, for worse. On the morning of October 21st, in Aberfan, Wales, a spoil tip, saturated with rainwater, suffered a partial but massive collapse, and the resulting slide surged down the mountain toward the village, a wave of liquefied debris 30 feet high. On its way down, it demolishes a farm, as well as 2 water mains, intensifying the flow, before tragically reaching the village, where it collides with the Pantglass Junior School. taking the lives of 109 children and 5 teachers. It was a horrific tragedy, one with significant cultural, political, and environmental implications. In times like these, a country turns toward its voices and leaders, a position that the Beatles, like it or not, occupy. So on November 6th, Brian Epstein is put in the awkward position of turning down a request for the Beatles to perform at a benefit for the victims of the Aberfan disaster. Brian wrote to the organizers, "Sincere admiration for your efforts, but I know without consulting them, the boys would feel unable to make an appearance of this sort for too many reasons to enumerate. However, subject to confirmation, I am sure they, and I, would gladly contribute £200 each to the fund to help." That is equivalent to about £3,200 today. On the very same day, Paul begins his driving tour of France. Paul, clever as he is, commissioned from Wig Creations, the cosmetic company that had worked with the Beatles for A Hard Day's Night, a simple disguise for him to wear during his holiday. They measure you and match the color of your hair, so it was like a genuine mustache with real glue. And I had a couple of pairs of glasses made with clear lenses, which just made me look a bit different. I put a long blue overcoat on and slicked my hair back with Vaseline and just wandered around, and of course nobody recognized me. In the morning, Paul drove his Aston Martin up onto the plane ferry at Lydd Airport, Kent. Yes, you heard correctly, a plane ferry. For your car. He arrived in France and first drove down to Paris, where he basked in his temporary anonymity, spending much of his time filming home videos throughout the city. I did a film that I wish I had now. I filmed a gendarme on traffic duty in Paris, and he was just stopping all the cars, so that was one roll through. It was a Bolex camera, and you could rewind so you could then go through again. The second time, he'd gone, so I just filmed all the traffic. It looked like this impossible job where the traffic was just going through him all the time. And while Paul was busy filming traffic in Paris, John returned to England, where he would stop by the Indica bookstore and gallery to attend a preview of an exhibition that would be opening there the next day. Unfinished paintings and objects by Yoko Ono.
And I had a bit of a hang-up about art too, having been to art school, and disliked the sort of attitude of the so-called artist, you know. So anyway, I finally got to this show, and she had all these things on, like all these like hammer nail things, and that clock there, you listen to it through a and at first I reacted like a mug, you know, like the ones that were saying they don't get a badge, you know. I was thinking, haha, don't fool me with all this junk, you know. So then there was this ladder and a thing on the ceiling. So I climbed the ladder, and on the ceiling it said, yes. You see, so I thought, oh, I agreed then. And then she came up and said, do you like to hammer a nail in? It's 5 shillings. So I said,
you didn't want to pay.
I didn't have any money either, so I said, I'll hammer an imaginary nail in and give you an imaginary 5 shillings. And she agreed to that, she accepted that, on the same basis as we accept her work, you know. I'd accepted her work, and that was how we met, actually.
A few days later, back in France, Paul drove down to Bordeaux, where he planned to meet with roadie Mal Evans. On the evening of the 11th, Paul, still in disguise, attempted to enter a discotheque, but was turned down by the bouncer. For the first time during his holiday, he felt the downside of being a quote-unquote nobody. So he returned to the discotheque, this time as Beatle Paul, where he was of course welcomed with open arms. And this reminded Paul that yes, he did like being famous. It was nice because I remembered what it was like to not be famous, and it wasn't necessarily any better than being famous. Beautifully put, Paul. On the 12th, Paul met with Mal Evans, and the two began driving through the south of France. Our route took us through San Sebastian, Madrid, Cordoba, and Malaga to Torremolinos. The original intention was to drive east all along the coastline beside the Mediterranean and meet up with John at Almeria. But by phoning London, we found that John had finished work on How I Won the War earlier than expected. Let's hear from Mal. That's torn it, explained Paul. Okay, how about a safari as compensation? Spain isn't really safari country, Paul, I replied blankly. "No, but Kenya is," came the prompt reply. In no time, the spur-of-the-moment schedule was planned. We flew to Madrid, then another plane from Madrid to the city of Nairobi in Kenya. So it was here in Nairobi that they were joined by Jane Asher, and the trio spent their time sightseeing, staying at the famous Treetop Hotel, the hotel where Queen Elizabeth II had been residing when she ascended to the throne in 1952. On the 19th, they headed back to England. So we finally circle back to our intro. On the plane ride home, Paul dreams up the alter ego of the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And the story behind that name, specifically, is one that Paul has told hundreds and hundreds of times. Let's hear it again.
At the time, there were lots of those sort of bands that were, Laughing Joe and his medicine band, Thank You, Wham Bam Mam. So I just thought, if there was a band, what would be a mad name for it?
I was on a plane with our roadie and we were eating and he said, "Could you pass the salt and pepper?" And I thought he said Sgt. Pepper. I said, "What?" He said, "Salt and pepper." I said, "Oh, I thought you said Sgt. Pepper." So we had a laugh about that, but then the more I thought about it, Sgt. Pepper, that's kind of a cool character.
So at last, all four Beatles are in England, having spent more time apart than they have in years. In fact, possibly since they first left for Hamburg in 1960. Time to get back to work. The Beatles had made significant strides with Revolver, not only as an evolution of their songwriting, but sonically, aesthetically, using the recording studio as a creative weapon. And now, it was time to once again dial it up a notch. On their return to the studio on the 24th, the Beatles made it clear, right away, that things were going to continue to change. Jeff Emmerich shares the following account. John Lennon was even more agitated than usual. "Look," he said to George Martin, "it's really quite simple. We're fed up with making soft music for soft people, and we're fed up with playing for them too. But it's given us a fresh start, don't you see?" From the expression on his face, it was clear that George Martin didn't see. "We can't hear ourselves on stage anymore for all the screaming," Paul interjected earnestly. "So what's the point? We did try performing some songs off the last album, but there are so many complicated overdubs we can't do them justice. Now we can record anything we want, and it won't matter. And what we want is to raise the bar a notch, to make our best album ever." Another blank look from George Martin. Lennon persisted, talking rapid fire, a sure sign that he was starting to get annoyed. "What we're saying is, if we don't have to tour, then we can record music that we won't ever have to play live. And that means we can create something that's never been heard before, a new kind of record with new kinds of sounds." George Martin asked, "Right then, let's get to work. What have you got for me?" Paul started to say something, but before he could answer, John shouted out, "I've got a good one, for a starter." John could talk over most anyone if he wanted to, and he was never shy about jumping the queue. In fact, the first session for almost every Beatles album was devoted to recording one of his songs. A half smile played across Paul's face as he shrugged his shoulders, backing down gracefully. Phil McDonald and I strained to hear what was going on downstairs. Down in the studio, George Martin was perched, as usual, on his high stool, positioned in the midst of the four Beatles. John was standing directly in front of him, playing an acoustic guitar and singing softly. Because he wasn't close to any of the microphones we had arranged around the room, I had to push the faders up quite high to hear him. From the very first note, it was obvious that this new Lennon song was a masterpiece. He had created a gentle, almost mystical tribute to some mysterious place, a place he called Strawberry Fields. I had no idea what the lyric was about, but the words were compelling, like abstract poetry, and there was something magical in the spooky, detached timbre of John's voice. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence, broken by Paul, who in a quiet, respectful tone said simply, "That is absolutely brilliant." Most of the time, when Lennon played one of his songs through for the first time on acoustic guitar, we'd all think, "Wow, that's great." But this song was clearly something special. An instrument new to the recording studio, but already familiar to John, was moved from his home in Weybridge down to EMI Studios in London, and it is this instrument that immediately gives Strawberry Fields Forever its unique and timeless quality, the Mellotron. Time for some history. The Mellotron was developed in 1963 in Birmingham and was the younger, more charismatic sibling of a similar instrument, the Chamberlin. They are both electromechanical instruments, and the way they work is this. Rather than the depression of a particular key triggering the reverberation of a string, it instead triggers a playback head on a feed of audio tape. And this audio tape is what makes the instrument tick. Within the machine is contained audio tape of a variety of instruments running the scale of the keyboard. When the desired instrument is selected, like the violin, or in the case of Strawberry Fields, the flute, it will be the tape recordings of this instrument that will play on triggering of the key. And while the instrument may have been John's baby, it was not he, but Paul, who devised and composed the iconic Mellotron medley that leads us into the world of Strawberry Fields. So on this day, the band recorded one brilliant take of the song, with John on guitar and lead vocal, Paul on Mellotron, and Ringo on drums. Happy with the take, they immediately set to overdubs. John double-tracked his vocals, Ringo added maracas, George and Paul added backing harmonies, and George also added additional Mellotron for good measure. All of the recording for this day was done at 53 cycles. I can't speak for the specifics of this number, but the result of recording at this frequency was that on replay, the song played back ever so slightly faster, resulting in a marginal but noticeably higher pitch.
Living is easy with eyes closed. Living is easy with eyes closed.
We will see the Beatles utilize this technique all throughout Sgt. Pepper's. George Martin would recall, "It was a magical evening. We all loved the beginning to our new album and went home in the early hours of the next morning, tired but satisfied." This first recording is stunning, and yet this was just the beginning. And what better way to follow up Strawberry Fields than with the annual Beatles Christmas record? It's that time of year, all right. This pantomime-themed Christmas record was, unsurprisingly, mostly a Paul creation. The recording is a whole production, told in comedic, storybook fashion, ending with the piano-led finale, "Everywhere is Christmas."
Everywhere is Christmas. At the end of every year. Oh, everywhere is Christmas. At the end of every year.
Later in the day, both John and Paul, along with a star-studded cast of other musicians, including Donovan, Eric Clapton, Pete Townsend, Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, and Brian Jones, would attend a press reception at the Bag O' Nails Club for the Jimi Hendrix Experience, in which Jimi and his band nearly blew the roof off the damn place. It would be hard to overstate just how much admiration and excitement Jimi Hendrix generated, not just before a crowd of fans, but before some of the most successful and talented musicians in the world. We'll now read an excerpt of writing from a lucky fan who did get to attend the reception, Charles Hawley. "My girlfriend Winifred managed to get 2 tickets, and we were the only people present who weren't part of rock's hierarchy. No one was more gobsmacked than Clapton. I was torn between watching his face and Hendrix's performance."
Yeah, we're gonna try to do one more song for you, all right?
Before John and Paul left, they stopped by the dressing rooms to give their regards, as hilariously recalled by Noel Redding. Afterwards, in the dressing room, Lennon walked in, which freaked me out. He was saying, "Fucking grand." He loved it. And then McCartney walked in, and that freaked me out even more.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
Strawberry Fields would continue to evolve. Unlike the first take recorded the last session, which jumped right into the verse, this recording began with a beautifully simple Mellotron intro, played by Paul. Hearing the instrument unaccompanied, isolated, and alone allows one to hear the unique characteristic of the sound and is the perfect introduction into the world that Strawberry Fields creates. Paul's inspiration really set the stage. In many ways, it was a harbinger of things to come over the next several months. The perfect, unique introduction to a series of near-perfect, near-unique sessions. Work on the rhythm track continued until the next day, with additional overdubs added, as well as artificially doubling John's vocal, which was his preference by this point. The song was fleshing out, but was it for the better? Time will tell. We move into December, and with December, of course, comes another edition of the Beatles Monthly, which contained a written excerpt from a press conference, including one question I found humorous. The interviewer asked, "Are you all going to have a hand in writing your next movie?" To which John responded, "Who? Me? I don't think so. I'd sooner leave somebody else to write our film scripts. I don't know how to do it." Maybe Paul took this as a challenge. The Beatles began their day by recording Christmas messages for pirate radio stations, Radio Caroline and Radio London. Time for another very quick history lesson. At this period of time in the UK, the BBC had complete domain over radio broadcasting. If you wanted radio, guess what? Your only choice was BBC. And quite a few people weren't so happy about this. Radio Caroline and Radio London, to circumvent broadcasting laws, literally took their equipment out to sea into international waters, where they could get away with what would normally be an illegal broadcast. Their stations were such an enormous success that the BBC would copy the format of their programming. These pirate stations directly led to the creation of the BBC Radio 1 pop station. More so, hilariously, many of these illegal radio jockeys from both Caroline and London would later end up employed at BBC. Lesson over. The Beatles, in a show of support for these pirate stations, took the time to record them some special messages.
Everywhere it's Christmas, so this is John Lennon wishing you a very happy one.
On behalf of the Beatles, it is Paul McCartney saying, have a happy Christmas holiday, and is wishing you success and good health all through 1967.
After that, it was time for another act of defiance, led by Paul, to stop the erasure of granny music from popular culture. Just kidding. Today, they began work on the first song that would actually end up on the Sgt. Pepper's LP, When I'm 64. This song was one of the first that Paul had ever written, with its origins dating all the way back to April or May of 1956, when Paul was 14 years old. The song would float around as a novelty during their set list for years to come.
The very, very last time we played with the Beatles was August the 3rd, 1963. We went down a store and the Beatles went on, and we couldn't wait to see them because we hadn't seen them for a few months. And the power went. All the Beatles' gear had gone off. And so the Beatles, being the Beatles, didn't bother them at all. They just, Paul went on the piano, John and George playing their guitars. You could just about hear the guitars because they were playing them acoustically, no amplifiers. And Paul played this, what we thought was a musical song, an old musical song. And we thought that for many years. We didn't remember it until I heard it 3 or 4 years later. And it was, when I get older, losing my hair, many years from now. Well, it was, that was the song.
Being well practiced, the song needed little rehearsal, and they put down 2 very basic rhythm tracks, composed only of Paul's bass, John's rhythm guitar, some drums from Ringo, and a guide vocal from Paul.
When I get older, losing my hair.
Next, they overdubbed piano and a snare from Ringo. George, a staunch critic of granny music, did not participate on the recording, despite being present at the session. George Martin had not been too thrilled with the past few recordings of Strawberry Fields. He himself was still firmly in favor of the much more gentle initial take, and he said as much to John following the day's work back on the 29th. It started to get heavy. It wasn't the gentle song I had first heard. We ended up with a record which was very good heavy rock. Still, that was apparently what John wanted, so I metaphorically shrugged my shoulders and said, well, that wasn't really what I'd thought of, but it's okay. And off John went. A week later, he came back and said, I've been thinking about it too, George. Maybe what we did was wrong. I think we ought to have another go at doing it. It was decided that the song would be remade, and John asked George Martin to arrange a score for the song, with Paul helping to contribute some of the musical ideas they would like to include. George Martin agreed. But Martin wouldn't be present at the studio today, nor Jeff Emmerich, who begrudgingly agreed to accompany Martin to the premiere of Cliff Richard's film, Finders Keepers. In their absence, Dave Harries took over the session, and the Beatles, sensing that Mommy and Daddy had left them alone, went a little wild on the remake of the song's rhythm track. When Martin and Emmerich returned from their film, they found the Beatles still there, at the studio. When Jeff and I strolled in at about 11, Studio 2 was in the grip of a controlled riot. The boys had decided it would be fun to lay down an unusual rhythm track on their own, with anyone and everybody available simply banging away on whatever came to hand. The racket as we walked in was like something from a very bad Tarzan movie. John and Paul were bashing bongo drums. George was on huge kettle drums, joined sporadically by Paul. Neil Aspinall was playing a gourd scraper, Mal Evans a tambourine, and George's friend Terry Duran was shaking maracas. Someone else was tinkling away on finger cymbals. Above it all, Ringo was struggling manfully to keep the cacophony together with his regular drum kit. The Beatles were at play, and here I was coming in to party poop. Towards the end of this rogue track, which Dave Harries, as stand-in engineer, was doing his best to record, everyone was whooping or yelling, and John can clearly be heard chanting, very slowly, and in time to the rough and ready beat. Why cranberry sauce? Why not? It was coming up to Christmas. It was now time for extensive overdubbing, and once again, the Beatles brought their creative best, as recalled by George Martin. George Harrison brought in a swarmandal, a sort of North Indian table harp. The only way he knew how to play it was to stroke it as you would a real harp, so he spent ages tuning it to produce the right selection of notes. His patience rewarded us well, because the glissando he charmed out of the instrument was tremendous, adding a fantastically good effect when we dropped it into our rhythm track. John discovered a way of making the Mellotron play not just one, but a whole random sequence of notes, which gives Strawberry Fields Forever another marvelous touch of madness towards the end. Paul then came up with an inspired piece of ringing lead guitar work that rounded the song off brilliantly. It was this combination of different elements, traditional rock, Indian influence, and the utilization of more recent technology, like the Mellotron, that would come to define the sound of Sgt. Pepper's, as well as massively influencing the sound of psychedelia going forward. But let's make one thing clear. As of this day, no pop song had ever sounded like Strawberry Fields.
But you know I know and it's a dream.
It was finally the day to record George Martin's string and brass arrangement for Strawberry Fields, and doing so was no easy feat. Martin had packed a fair amount of complexity in the song's 4 minutes. I confess I had heard a lot of American records with very groovy horn sections by this time, and lifted 1 or 2 ideas from them. As the song developed further, it seemed natural to use the trumpets as a harmony behind the voice, sounding the same phrase as in our lovely intro. Then came the only section I had qualms about. At this particular point, the tempo is held together by a fast rhythm from a cymbal that Ringo recorded back backwards. Never an easy sound to latch onto. The cellos worked against this urgent beat with a slower, triplet time motif, and I was not at all sure that it was going to work. But now, I am happy to say, I cannot imagine the song without it. Recording the parts I had written was very difficult to get exactly right. All 4 trumpets had to play loud, punchy, spiky stabs in perfect time, while the cello parts demanded equally accurate and strident bowing. They had to fit our frenetic rhythm track to perfection, which I found to be virtually impossible. I had quite forgotten that our kindergarten rhythm play-in inevitably did not conform to a rigid quartz-controlled beat. The tempo was all over the place. After some patience, the feat was complete, and to finish the day off, John overdubbed additional lead vocals and some harmonies. On the 16th of December, Beatles fans everywhere breathed a long sigh of relief as the anxiously awaited 4th Beatles Christmas message came tumbling down their chimneys. Beatles goon it up again, writes New Musical Express. All is well in the world. But late at night, the next day, a man and his girlfriend are driving through South Kensington. He's a wealthy young man, with a fast car to boot. His name is Tara Brown, heir to the Guinness fortune. He is only 21 years old. For some years now, he's been very interested in art, and having plenty of money to throw around, he has used it to ingratiate himself in the swinging London scene, financing exhibits and mod shops, and making himself quite a few famous friends, including Brian Jones and Paul McCartney. In fact, it has even been rumored that he was there for Paul's very first LSD trip. His girlfriend's name is Suki Patier. She is 19 years old and works as a model in London. They leave a restaurant at 11:50 p.m., and as midnight nears, Tara speeds down the road. Whether it be a result of the speed and the alcohol, or a tragic lapse in attention, Tara fails to see a traffic light ahead and runs through the junction of Redcliffe Square and Redcliffe Gardens, hitting a parked lorry at high speeds. Tara would suffer significant head injuries and die in the hospital the next day. Suki, miraculously, was not injured. She claims he swerved the car at the last moment so that the driver's side took the brunt of the crash. The tragic story would run in the Daily Mirror newspaper the next day, on the 19th. On Tuesday the 20th, the Beatles came in to record some final backing vocals for When I'm 64. On their way in, they were interviewed by ITN News.
Are the Beatles going to go their own ways in 1967?
They could be, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing.
Good evening. Hello. John Edwards, ITN.
How are you?
Can I just have a brief word with you?
Yeah?
If you never toured again, would it worry you?
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
Wouldn't worry you?
But because the only thing about that, you see, is that performance for us, see, it's gone downhill, performance, because we can't develop when no one can hear us, you know what I mean? So for us to perform is it's difficult, gets difficult each time.
I just want to ask you, do you think that in the new year that you're going to be going your own ways instead of being as a group?
No.
No?
No, George, definitely not.
What about another word?
There are many more words.
You're looking very smart anyway.
Yes, I am. Well, I had a bath.
What's all this about that the Beatles are going to do less together in the new year?
Yeah, we won't be too... The thing is, you see, to do things together, the 4 of us, it's going to be the old things all over again, you know. So the thing is, because of the film, you know, we can't get a decent script, or we're still trying for one. If we don't do that, we'll most probably all do something else different, you know, for next year.
On your own?
Yes, but, I mean, it's not like breaking up. We'll still be coming back together at the end of it.
It is now time for the orchestral overdubs for Paul's When I'm 64. And Paul tells Martin he would like them to have a, quote, tooty sound. How lovely. Paul wants to use clarinets for the song, and Martin agrees. Clarinets it shall be. And whether Paul intended it or not, Martin recalls that the additions of clarinets, quote, gave added bite to the song, a formality that pushed it firmly towards satire. Without that, the song could have been misinterpreted. It was very tongue-in-cheek. And with that, the very first song to be included on the Sgt. Pepper's LP is complete. Strawberry Fields had been weighing heavily on John's mind. Everything recorded so far had been good. Fantastic, in fact. But still, something wasn't right. They had initially finished the song in late November, before John decided they should remake it. So they did, orchestral overdubs and all, and by December 15th, they had finished it again. But just a few days after that, John came up to speak to both Geoff Emerick and George Martin. He had an idea. The following account was shared by Emerick. John says, "I've been listening to these acetates of Strawberry Fields a lot, and I've decided that I still prefer the beginning of the original version." My jaw dropped. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see George Martin blinking slowly. I could almost detect his blood pressure rising. Ignoring both of us, Lennon continued, "So what I'd like our young Jeffrey here to do is join the two bits together." George Martin let out a big sigh. "John, we'd be glad to do that," he said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. "The only thing that stands in our way is the fact that the two versions were played in different keys and at different tempos." John appeared nonplussed. I'm not sure he even understood why that presented a problem. "You can do it," he said simply. With that, he turned and headed out the door. "What do you think, Jeff?" a deflated George asked me, after John had gone. My reply was non-committal. "I'm not sure. I guess all we can do is have a go." So Martin and Emerick went to the task. I think it is sometimes forgotten, to the casual fan at least, just how significant the contributions of both Martin and Emerick were. They were world-class engineers, creative visionaries in their own right, and to add to that, they knew how to navigate the world of the Beatles, the egos, the outlandish ideas. It was time to do so, again. George Martin recalled, "John always left this kind of thing to me. He never professed to know anything about recording. He was the least technical of the Beatles. He had a profound faith in my ability to cope with such problems, a faith which was sometimes misplaced, as I certainly felt it was on this occasion. But I had to have a go. I listened to the two versions again, and suddenly realized that with a bit of luck, I might get away with it, because, with the way that the keys were arranged, the slower version was a semitone flat, compared with the faster one. We called up our magnificent band of backroom boys, who wielded a Diplodocus-sized washing machine look-alike, the frequency changer. This valve-powered monster, a lash-up devised by Ken Townsend, our chief engineer, and his merry men, took the mains electricity supply and bent the alternating current up and down on either side of the normal 50 cycles per second. Don't ask me how they did it. I haven't a clue. What I can tell you is that it used to get very hot and would explode in a shower of sparks if you stretched it too far. But it was all we had. We hooked it up. We were looking for a point in the song where there was a sound change, which would help us disguise the edit of the century. We found it precisely 1 minute in. I thought, if I can speed up the one and slow down the other, I can get the pitches the same. And with any luck, the tempos will be sufficiently close not to be noticeable. I did just that, selecting precisely the right spot to make the cut, to join them as nearly perfectly as possible. That is how Strawberry Fields was issued, and that is how it remains today. The Beatles were not present during the madness, but John stopped by afterward. According to Emerick, John popped by to see how we were getting on. I had literally finished the edit just a few moments before he arrived. As we played the results of our labors to John for the first time, he listened carefully, head down, deep in concentration. I made a point of standing in front of the tape machine so that he couldn't see the splice go by. A few seconds after the edit flew past, Lennon lifted his head up and a grin spread across his face. "Has it passed yet?" he asked. "Sure had," I replied proudly. "Well, good on you, Jeffrey," he said. He absolutely loved what we had done. We played it over and over again that night for John, and at the conclusion each time, he'd turn to us and repeat the same 3 words, eyes wide with excitement. Brilliant. Just brilliant. With that, and the holidays fast approaching, the Beatles took a moment to breathe, thrilled with the work they had completed so far. It was time for a short break, but Paul was working away on what may have been a response to John's Strawberry Fields. Paul's own approach to that same tinted nostalgia, a series of pictures passing before a child's eyes. And this place was a street named Penny Lane. There could not be a more perfect encapsulation of the dichotomy between a John lyric and a Paul lyric, even when writing for an extremely similar subject matter. They both present to the listener a transportive, sacred place. A place, perhaps, representing a sense of comfort, of escape, and through the communication of that idea, we see just how differently John and Paul view the world. Throughout the lyrics of Strawberry Fields, John presents both a deep insecurity, a sense of feeling othered, while at the same time displaying a defiance, a turning away from judgment, both from himself or others. It is an incredibly vulnerable and empowering lyric. Meanwhile, here comes Paul with that same childlike perspective, this time down the street of Penny Lane. It is a lyric straight out of a storybook, a series of observations, of passing imagery. As a listener, you can almost feel yourself strolling down the lane, turning your head as you go, looking by at the passing shops and patrons. There is a magic in the air, and yet, not everything is as it seems. A surreal veneer clings to this street. Behind the shelter in the middle of a roundabout, a pretty nurse is selling poppies from a tray, and though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway. But this is simply the nature of things. Paul finds nothing but wonder and comfort in these observations. Present is none of John's insecurity, nor his defiance. Paul simply lets it wash over him, and all is well. It is a masterpiece for Paul, just as Strawberry Fields is for John. Two songs that are so alike, yet could hardly be more different. While most of the engineers worked on finalizing the mix for Strawberry Fields in the Studio 3 control room, Paul sat down in Studio 2 and went to work on Penny Lane. To start, he spent some time perfecting the distinctive piano backing for the song, recording 6 takes on a Steinway grand piano. The 6th and final take was the best, and Paul set to recording overdubs. He started first with another recording from the Steinway, this time fed through a Vox amplifier with a tremolo effect, to give it some movement, while Ringo simultaneously played tambourine. Paul then added a third piano part, using EMI's Mrs. Mills upright piano, while Ringo played drums, and another, unnamed Beatle, added more tambourine. Finally, he recorded some harmonium, also run through the Vox amplifier, and with that, work was done for the day. They would record vocals for Penny Lane the next afternoon, though these would end up scrapped, and before finalizing the mix for When I'm 64, Paul requested that the engineers speed the song up almost an entire semitone so as to keep it light and not too turgid. And using the magic of modern technology, we can hear what the song sounded like originally.
When I get older, losing my head. When I get older, losing my head.
So comes New Year's. 1967 will be a year like no other, and despite only recording 3 songs so far, the Beatles and their team could not be any more excited for their next project. There is something magical in the air, and everybody can feel it. The rest will have to wait till part 2. Want to see more Beatles? I have a Patreon. For $1, you can watch videos early there, and for $2, you'll get exclusive content, including more casual podcast-type videos where me and my girlfriend, who is a new/first-time Beatles fan, listen and review the albums one by one from our differing perspectives. Any support you can give me on there helps me out so much. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Thank you again for watching. Until next time.